Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing week 42 of my 2020 reads. This week I finished 2 great buddy reads, and Sascha and I went to FIYAHCON, so I'm going to tell you all about that after I talk about what I read. So the first buddy read that I finished was Lady Susan, The Watsons, and Sanditon by Jane Austen. I buddy read this with Mariana and Mariana Quesada, who I will link below. I love buddy reading with Mariana. It's so much fun, especially because we have buddy read Jane Austen before, so kind of doing compare and contrast between Jane Austen's different works. If you're not familiar, this is actually a bind-up of Lady Susan, which is a short novella, and then 2 unfinished works. Jane Austen died while she was writing Sanditon, and The Watsons was one that she just never had intended to finish, or at least never got around to finishing. So I actually really thoroughly enjoyed this collection. It was so good. Lady Susan was hilarious. I absolutely loved it. So the first story was complete, and it's an epistolary story that is all about Lady Susan, who is the best. She is cunning, and she's ruthless, and she's self-centered, and she's so manipulative and so smart. She's basically this widow who just is out for herself, and she loves to manipulate other people. She's almost like a supervillain in her ability to manipulate social situations and get people on her side. And she just finds a lot of power and joy in doing that. And she's also just all out for herself and for money and for anything that she wants. So it's really fascinating to just see this character. And there's so much satire and so much humor in this. It was just, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then The Watsons is an unfinished novel that is very similar, I think, to a lot of other Jane Austen novels in the sort of shape of the story. We have a teenage girl who is part of a large but poor family who at a young age went to live with her aunt, who is richer. But later on, the aunt remarries, and the new husband doesn't want the girl around anymore, so she has to leave and go back to her family, who aren't in the best circumstances and who barely know her anymore. And so it's so much of this is really about kind of women's options, what they can do with their life, and how at the whim of kind of others they are. And there's just a lot of really interesting things in it. It's just so well written, and always the satire is so good. Then the last novel, the last fragment of a novel, Sanditon, is the work that Jane Austen was writing when she died. And that one also was really good. So that one is about a teenage girl in a large but somewhat poor family who gets invited to go spend some time with some richer people that they know who live in this place called Sanditon, which is this little seaside resort town. And it was so fascinating because so much of this is all about Sanditon, the place, because this is a seaside resort town, but it's really just a seaside town that one of the characters has decided should become a resort, that it's perfect for a resort. So much of this is about this kind of resort town life, and all of the different characters are so interesting. And I think that the satire also is very strong in this one, the social satire of just people being kind of ridiculous. I thought there was a lot of interesting things, for example, about one of the sets of characters in this are some kind of middle-aged women who have a ton of energy but like to also pretend that they are invalids, because that gets them a lot of attention, and it's just so over the top. So this was a ton of fun too. I actually really enjoyed this entire collection. I think one of the things that made it work so well for me is that the humor was so strong in all of these, and there weren't really romances. So I have noticed that I struggle a lot with Jane Austen's romances. Like I get annoyed with the male leads, and I don't find them very romantic. But because Lady Susan was very much not about a romantic male lead, and because the other 2 were fragments, so they didn't really get to the point where a romantic lead would come in, there wasn't any romance, and I think that that really made them work a lot better for me. I do love romance in general, but just I struggle sometimes with the male leads that Jane Austen has. So I thoroughly enjoyed this collection, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Definitely ranks up in the top of Jane Austen's works for me. The other buddy read that I finished this week was Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. I buddy read this with Freddie at Sluggish Reader, who I will link below. And you guys, if you are not already subscribed to Freddie and you like literary fiction, you should definitely check him out. He's a Malaysian booktuber who is just adorable and so funny. He has a very kind of quiet sense of humor, but I laugh at like all of his videos, and he reads a ton of backlist literary fiction, especially by women, and just I get so many ideas for books that I want to read based on his channel. So if you haven't checked him out and you like literary fiction, do go ahead and check him out. I will link him down below. But it was such a great experience to buddy read Their Eyes Were Watching God with him, because this book was a real challenge for me. I actually struggled really a lot to read this book. I think that maybe because I don't read enough literary fiction, I just don't quite have some of the skills that I need to read it, but it was a real struggle for me to get through this. It was very slow. I think that this book took me maybe 3 times the amount of time to read it as it would a normal book, and it was just so slow and so hard. But the book itself was so well written and also just so fascinating in terms of the themes that it had, that I can tell it is an excellent book even if I struggled a ton to read it. So it was super helpful to have Freddie there kind of as a buddy system to motivate me to keep trying and also to discuss with, because our discussions were excellent. My experience reading this book, the best way I can describe it is kind of if you go on a hike in the mountains and it's a really steep path and you're just struggling so much and you're so tired and you just, you know, it's so hard to keep going, and then you take a breather and you stop and you look out and the view is just spectacular and you kind of understand why you're going through all of that struggle and pain. So that's kind of what this book was like for me. I think that in the future, if I want to read Zora Neale Hurston, I need to wait and like level up my skill ability when it comes to reading literary fiction. The other thing that I thought was a little bit challenging for me in this, and maybe one of the reasons why I read it so slowly, was that maybe 80% of the book was written in dialogue, and that dialogue was written in a very local dialect. I'll put up an image of kind of what it looks like, but I was really just slow in reading that. I thought that the speech patterns came across really clearly. It was very consistent, all of that, but it just slowed me down a lot. I think that if I hadn't been kind of on a timeline for when I was reading this, I might have even tried the audiobook, even though I don't generally like audiobooks, simply because I think it would be easier to listen to. So if anybody else starts this book and is kind of struggling with parsing all of that dialogue, I just wonder if an audiobook might be the way to go. But in any case, so those were my struggles, but let me talk about why this book was really awesome. And so much of this is just due to the content and the themes, and I love the way that Freddie pulled out so many different aspects of the book and just kind of made it really approachable for me. So I loved the discussion with Freddie. But basically, the story is about Janie. Janie is a woman in Florida. She grows up with her grandmother. Her grandmother used to be a slave. And Janie grows up with her grandmother, and there's a lot about the way that Janie becomes a woman. So much of this follows her from her teenagehood through her 40s and really looks at her blossoming into womanhood and a lot of the ways that society and even loved ones, that their strictures and their pressure kind of limited her and oppressed her. So in this story, you follow Janie as she grows up and as she deals with being married and kind of the expectations on her as a wife, and the way that everybody kind of tries to limit her and keep her into this small little box when really she's somebody who just wants to fly free. There's so much beautiful imagery in this as well. Things about her hair kind of representing her womanhood and her sensuality, and all of this imagery about flowers. And it's just, clearly this is a book that has tons of different layers, that has a lot of really important messages as well. This is something that takes place at the turn of the 20th century, and I believe that, I didn't look this up, but I believe that this was probably written in the 1930s, something around that. I'll correct it if I'm wrong. And this focuses especially on Janie in her 40s being this woman who is reclaiming her sexuality. And I think that that's awesome. It's so cool. Also, it's so neat that all of this takes place in a very interesting time period, because you have all of these kind of communities of Black people in Florida who are coming together and who are trying to build up something new, especially after emancipation. And it's just such a fascinating period in history, and fascinating that we follow Janie. So this book is clearly really well written and really impressive in terms of what it tackles. But it was so hard for me to read. So for me, for this reading experience, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. But definitely this is something I'd love to revisit when I'm like a better literary fiction reader in the future. And then I wouldn't be surprised if I would give it 5 stars. But just for this reading experience, it was quite hard for me. Okay, so those were the books that I read this week. If you've read either of those books, let me know what your thoughts were down below. I'd love to hear what kind of your experience was with either of them, or if you're just interested in reading them or you have anything else to say, just leave me a comment. Now I want to move on to talking about FIYAHCON. So I was so excited about FIYAHCON, and it lived up to my expectations. It was such a great experience. If you're not familiar, I will link a little video that I did about FIYAHCON below, but it is basically a brand new convention. It was held for the first time this year, completely virtually, so it was over the weekend, and it was hosted by FIYAH Magazine, which is a magazine that does short speculative fiction by Black authors. I have bought a bunch of the issues and I am working through them right now. So this con was something that really centered BIPOC voices, and I think that it was something that you could feel the need for this, because so many of the other conventions just end up being really overwhelmingly white, and a lot of the discussions are directed at a white audience, and a lot of also the books that get discussed are by white authors. And so it was so cool to see just all of these panels that were really about issues that mattered and that people cared about within the BIPOC community, and just really centering those experiences. So it was just such a great convention. It was so well run, and especially given that they got it up and running so quickly, I was really impressed with everything that they did. So it just had such a really beautiful, joyful feel to it. So I had a ton of fun. I wanted to talk about a couple of the panels that I thought were really fascinating in terms of their discussions, as well as the IGNYTE Awards, because they gave away literary awards, which was so cool. So the first panel that I want to talk about is The End of the Age of Empires. And this was a panel just kind of talking about how problematic it is that there is so much in speculative fiction focusing on empires and how that's kind of a problem. And that was a great discussion. I particularly liked Aishwarya Subramanian, who is a reviews editor at Strange Horizons, had a really good point about how a lot of the narrative that happens in SFF is this kind of adventure story of somebody leaving home to go to foreign lands and doing things there, where everybody's like, oh my gosh, you're amazing, maybe getting all the women, all the resources, etc., and then coming back home. And Subramanian talked about how that is such an imperialist type of storyline, and it's something that really came out of the end of, you know, the British Empire and these sorts of things. It was such a fascinating way to think about a lot of the ways that stories in SFF play out, and how that kind of reinforces a lot of this imperialist ideology. So that was a really fascinating discussion. There was also a middle grade SFF panel, which was so much fun. It was moderated by Carlos Hernandez, who wrote Zeale and Gabi Break the Universe, and he was such a great moderator. He was so great. Sush was just like, you know, I see so much of Zeale in him. He was joyful and so excited, and he did all this research about every single panelist and like brought up fascinating little tidbits about them, and just, it was so joyful. And there were a couple of authors that I hadn't really known about before who I definitely want to read now. First was Kwame Mbalia, who wrote the Tristan Strong series, and that's already on my radar, but like it's really bumped up now. He was awesome, just so sweet and just so good at explaining complex ideas, and just, I don't know, that you just have this warmth from him, and I really want to read his series. The other one was Royce, who has a debut middle grade coming out in January called Root Magic, which is all about some kids who discovered like their heritage folk magic in South Carolina, and it just sounds so good. It's a Southern Gothic, so it's got a little bit of kind of that Gothic feel to it, and I loved everything she had to say, so I'm definitely putting that on my TBR as well. Another panel that I thought was really, really good was Living Cultures, How to Avoid Mythological Pitfalls. And this was all about how, you know, when you're writing about something, you're taking inspiration from a particular culture or mythology, like it's really important to recognize if this is a living culture, if people still believe in these ideas, that it's really important you give it respect. And there were a couple of panelists who brought up some really great ideas. One was Susan Palumbo, who is a Canadian author of descent from Trinidad and Tobago. And the other was Sascha Stronach, who is a Maori New Zealand author who wrote the Dawnhounds, which won the 2020 Sir Julius Vogel Awards, which also is a book that I want to read. And they were talking about how important it is that when you are inspired by some culture or mythology, that you don't just like grab the shiny thing and insert it with absolutely no context or research into your work, but that when you include something, you need to show respect for it. You need to thoroughly research it, make sure that you're getting it right, make sure that you're including the context and including the whole of the meaning, and not just taking like the shiny bit as if, you know, you had a right to it without any sort of respect for where it came from. And I thought that was just such a really good point, and just a fascinating discussion by them. And the last panel that I want to talk about, there were a bunch of other panels, but the last one that I want to talk about is AAVE, Pidgin, and the Global Patois. And this is all about including dialect in your writing. And this was, again, such a great conversation. I particularly liked Royce, again, the author of Root Magic, was part of this. And there was also another author, Christopher Caldwell, who is a queer Black American who lives in Glasgow and writes short SFF. And they had some really important points to make about how including a dialect is something that, although mainstream readers may not be comfortable or familiar with it, that doesn't mean that they can't just be up to the challenge. That if it's written in a way that they can approach, it's still very, very worthwhile, and that it's an important part of expressing that character's culture, who they are, by allowing them to have that voice. And I think that that was really interesting and really spoke to me, given that I had just finished Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I'd struggled so much with the dialect in that. And it's one of those things of just kind of being up to that challenge and not thinking that everything has to be 100% the way that you're used to, right? And really, I liked that they talked about kind of decentering the mainstream as the only person who matters for understanding that it can be important to just tell that character's story. In addition to the panels, which were just so wonderful, there was also the IGNYTE Awards, which I thought was done so, so well. It was hosted by Jessie at Bowties and Books, who is a booktuber. I will link them below, and they did such an amazing job. It was so wonderful. They were so calm and professional and did like the best job at pronouncing all of these different names, and it was such a really joyful experience, especially because the people who ran the con had come out with a short list that I think that they compiled, and it was already just by nature an incredibly great combination of BIPOC writers. And so I was so excited about basically all of the different books in all the different categories, and some of my favorites won awards. So for Best Adult Novel, Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno Garcia won. I was so happy. I really wanted that book to win awards because it's just so good. And New Sons, edited by Nisi Shawl, won for Best Anthology, and I thought that that was such a great collection. I read that earlier this year, and it just had so many amazing stories in it. So that made me really happy. Plus, there were a number of other things that won that I'm interested in particular for Best Middle Grade. Tristan Strong Punches a Hole in the Sky, which was by Kwame Mbalia, won, and I really want to read that. So it was just such a wonderful experience to listen to all of the panels and to see the awards, and I just absolutely loved the experience. I had such a good time. They did say that they will consider opening up their archives maybe in the new year, in case people want to pay after the fact to have access to them. So that there's nothing that's going to be happening in the next couple of months about that, but you might consider emailing them and asking if that's something that you're really interested in, just to kind of let them know that that's something that people want. But I'm really hoping that they're gonna continue and do this next year, and I think that it's gonna be so awesome if they do, because it was just the kind of con that Sascha and I had been really wanting to see. The panels were all so fascinating, and just the awards made me so happy. So I loved FIYAHCON, and I can't wait to go and read all of their issues. I have started some of them, but I need to actually finish things. So if anybody else went to FIYAHCON, I know I saw a couple of my friends there. Let me know what panels you loved or any kind of highlights of the weekend. I'd just be really curious, and yeah, anything at all that you guys want to talk about with me, just leave me a comment down below.